The prairie wind howled through the slats of the weather-beaten barn, rattling the loose boards like bones in a box. Jedediah Carter pulled his coat tighter and leaned against the doorway, pipe clamped between his teeth though the tobacco inside had long gone cold. He told himself he liked nights like this, lonely, dark, and sharp enough to cut through old memories. But the truth was he endured them, the same way he endured the ache in his leg or the silence in his house. The cattle were restless, shifting in their stalls. He muttered a curse, thinking it was coyotes prowling nearby, when a sound broke through the wind, too soft, too fragile to be anything wild. A knock, faint, almost apologetic, against the barn door. Jed froze. Out here, miles from the nearest town, there were no visitors after dark, only trouble. His hand brushed the butt of the revolver on his hip as he pushed the door open. A figure swayed in the lantern light. Small. Thin. A child, shivering, cheeks hollow, lips cracked. Dark eyes stared at him from beneath a tangle of hair, eyes too large for that starved face. Jed blinked, wondering if he was conjuring ghosts again. But the boy didn't vanish. He trembled like a leaf, one bare foot dragging in the dirt, a ragged blanket wrapped around his shoulders. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Jed's mind ran to the worst possibilities, raid scouts, a trick, some kind of trap. Yet the boy's knees buckled, and Jed lunged forward, catching him before he hit the ground. His skin was fever-hot, his body frighteningly light, as if half the boy's weight had been carried away by hunger. "Hell," Jed muttered, dragging him inside. He set him near the warmth of the lantern, dug out a tin plate, and scraped beans from a pot still warm on the stove. The boy sniffed, his stomach giving him away. He reached hesitantly, like an animal uncertain if the hand before him offered food or a blow. "Go on," Jed urged, pushing the plate closer. "Ain't poison." The boy devoured the beans with shaking hands, pausing only to glance up, wide-eyed, as if expecting Jed to snatch it back. When the plate was clean, he licked it like a dog, then clutched it to his chest. Jed poured water into a tin cup and handed it over. The boy drained it in 3 gulps. For the first time, Jed really looked at him. The high cheekbones, the straight black hair, the beadwork frayed on the blanket, there was no mistaking it. A native child. Jed sat back hard on the stool. His stomach knotted. He'd spent half his life fighting wars that carved canyons between men like him and children like this. He remembered flames rising from villages, remembered faces vanishing in smoke. And now, one of their own sat in his barn, breathing because Jed had kept him so. The boy met his gaze with suspicion but not fear. There was defiance in those eyes, even under the weight of exhaustion. Jed cleared his throat. "Well, kid, looks like you found the sorriest excuse for a host on the frontier." The boy said nothing, only blinked slowly. English meant nothing to him. Jed tried again, tapping his chest. "Jed. Name's Jed." Then he pointed at the boy, raising his eyebrows in question. Silence. The boy lowered his head, gripping the blanket tighter. Jed sighed. "Guess I'll have to call you something. Little Hawk, maybe. You've got the eyes for it." At that, the boy tilted his head, as though trying to decide if the sound was meant as insult or kindness. Jed almost smiled. The storm outside deepened, snow beginning to whisper against the walls. Jed laid down another blanket, gesturing for the boy to lie. He hesitated, then curled up on the rough bedding, eyes never leaving Jed. For hours, the man and the child kept watch over each other in silence. But sleep never came easy for Jed. He stirred the embers in the stove and sat back, memories chewing at him. He thought of his little sister, Ellie, dead before her 10th birthday from fever and hunger while he'd been off chasing glory with a rifle. He'd buried too many children, seen too many vanish in dust and fire. Perhaps that was why he hadn't turned this one away. By dawn, the storm had thinned, leaving the land washed clean in a pale light. Jed stepped outside, stretching his sore back. The air smelled of frozen sage. He spat into the dirt, ready to set about chores, when a sound drifted from the valley below, a low, rhythmic thrum. Drums. At first he thought the wind was playing tricks. But then the ground itself seemed to answer, carrying a pulse that grew heavier, louder. Jed squinted at the horizon, and his gut turned cold. They came like a tide. Riders cresting the hills, 200 strong, lances gleaming, war paint bright against the morning sun. The sight stole the breath from his lungs. His barn, his cattle, his very skin, all of it felt suddenly small against that wave of fury rolling toward him. Behind him, the boy stirred, stepping into the doorway, blanket dragging in the dirt. His eyes widened as he saw them, yet he didn't cry out. He only looked at Jed, silent and expectant, as if the man had already chosen his side. Jed's hand closed around the doorframe, splinters biting his palm. The warriors fanned out across the plain, surrounding his land like storm clouds gathering for a strike. The boy's fate, his own fate, the weight of every past sin, suddenly it all stood here, ready to be judged. Jed whispered, almost to himself, "What in God's name have I done?" The drumbeat quickened, echoing through the valley, and the riders pressed closer. The prairie, once quiet, now held its breath, waiting for blood. The riders poured across the valley like a flood of hooves and steel, the morning sun flashing off spearpoints and painted shields. Jed's heart thudded in rhythm with the drums, his hand itching toward the revolver, though he knew 6 bullets against 200 would be a fool's gamble. The boy stood near his leg, chin lifted, blanket clutched at his shoulders. The child's stillness unnerved him. He seemed neither surprised nor afraid, only braced for what must come. The first line of warriors drew up just short of the barn, horses snorting steam into the air. They fanned out in a crescent, bows already strung, eyes burning with suspicion. A single rider dismounted, tall and broad-shouldered, his chest scarred, his hair braided with bone. His presence silenced the others. The boy stiffened, as though he recognized him. Jed didn't need a translation to know this was their leader. The chief strode forward with deliberate calm, each step heavy with authority. He pointed to the child, then to Jed, then spoke words that rolled like thunder. Jed caught nothing of the meaning, yet the tone carried sharp accusation. The surrounding warriors shouted in agreement, fists shaking, arrows drawn halfway back. Jed raised both hands, palms open. "I didn't take him. He came to me, starved, near dead. I fed him, that's all." His voice cracked with the effort to project calm he did not feel. "I ain't your enemy tonight." The leader's eyes narrowed. His answer came in guttural syllables, firm, unyielding. Jed's stomach clenched. He recognized condemnation when he heard it. The circle of horses pressed closer, their riders eager, itching for blood. Then the boy slipped forward. He darted past Jed, barefoot in the frost, and planted himself before the chief. His small arms spread wide as though to shield Jed from the gathered storm. The warriors faltered, confusion rippling through their ranks. The boy spoke rapidly in his own tongue, his voice thin but fierce. The chief regarded him with a face carved from stone. His hand dropped to the hilt of his knife, then lifted again, slowly, as though considering. His gaze shifted to Jed, measuring him, weighing his life against whatever words the child had spilled. Jed's throat tightened. He found his voice again, low and rough. "I fought men like you once," he admitted. "I killed, I burned. And I've carried the weight of it every damn day since. But this boy was dying, and I couldn't watch another child starve. That's the truth of it. If it means my neck, then so be it." Silence settled over the plain, heavy as iron. Even the horses seemed to wait. Then, from the back of the crowd, a warrior let out a bark of laughter. Another followed, muttering something sharp that drew grins from those nearby. The tension cracked slightly, though the threat of death still hung in the air. The chief stepped close enough for Jed to see the pale scar that split his brow. He studied him without blinking, then spoke again, slower this time, his tone edged with command. Jed caught only a few words repeated by others, something about camp and trial. Jed understood well enough. He was not free. His fate would not be decided here but in the heart of their people. He looked back at his barn, at the small, stubborn life he had built alone, then down at the boy who had bound him to this storm. There was no way to turn aside. "I'll ride," Jed said hoarsely. He touched his hat brim, a gesture of surrender and respect all at once. The chief barked an order. A horse was brought forward, its eyes wild, its flanks lathered with sweat. Jed mounted under 100 unblinking stares, the boy placed behind another rider. The circle broke, swallowing him whole, and the column began to move. As they rode, Jed kept his eyes on the horizon, though he could feel their suspicion prickling his skin. Every glance he caught was sharpened with hatred, yet threaded through it was something else, a kind of wary curiosity. He realized he was no longer just a trespasser in their land. He was a test, one they meant to drag to its bitter conclusion. Behind him, the barn shrank to a speck against the endless plain. The drums carried them deeper into the wild, each beat a nail sealing the coffin of his old life. The boy turned once, catching Jed's eye with a look that was neither comfort nor fear but a silent promise. Their fates were tied now, for better or worse. Jed clenched the reins tighter, the weight of his choice pressing heavier with every step of the horse. He had crossed a line that could never be walked back, and the road ahead shimmered with fire he could not yet see. Night descended with a cloak of ash and shadow, the only light the flickering torches that marked the edges of the encampment. Jed dismounted under the watchful eyes of warriors who had not spoken to him during the long ride. His legs ached from the saddle, but the weight pressing down on him was heavier than bone or muscle. It was the awareness that he had ridden straight into the lion's mouth. The camp thrummed with life. Fires snapped in the cold air, sending sparks into the sky. Women carried pots of broth, children peered from behind hides, dogs circled and barked. Jed felt hundreds of eyes following his every move, most with suspicion, some with outright hate. He kept his hands loose at his sides, his gaze steady, trying to project calm though his chest felt like a drum of its own. The boy was led away, swallowed into the crowd. Jed's heart jerked at the sight, an instinct to protect flaring before he mastered it. He was alone now, surrounded by people who saw him as a thief, a murderer, a symbol of ruin. Chief Iron Bear approached with a company of elders, each draped in furs and beads that caught the torchlight. They encircled Jed, their faces lined not only by age but by loss. When Iron Bear spoke, the words carried the gravity of judgment. Though Jed could not understand the language, the weight of accusation was unmistakable. He caught fragments through the gestures, through the crowd's murmurs, the boy, the hunger, the deaths that had come before. Jed drew a breath, forcing himself to stand straight. "I don't know how to make you believe me," he said quietly, though he doubted his words reached them. "But I didn't steal him. I only gave him food." One elder spat into the dirt. Another stepped forward, pointing to Jed's rifle slung across his back, muttering words that needed no translation: weapon, killer, blood. Iron Bear raised a hand, silencing the crowd. He gestured for Jed to follow. The procession led him through the heart of the camp, past tents painted with spirals and animals, past warriors sharpening blades, past children with wary eyes. They reached a clearing where a great fire blazed. Here the chief turned and barked a command. A circle formed around Jed. Warriors closed in, stamping the earth, their chants low and rhythmic, vibrating through the ground. Iron Bear spoke again, his voice rising like thunder. Then he pointed at Jed and drew his hand across the fire. The meaning struck clear: a trial. A test not of words but of spirit. Jed's mouth went dry. He had survived war, famine, and nights colder than stone, but he had never stood before 200 people demanding proof of his worth. He wanted to shout, to tell them this was madness. Yet something in their eyes stilled him. This was not cruelty, it was law, their way of measuring a man's truth. They brought forth a wild horse, black as coal, foam flecking its mouth, eyes rolling with fire. The beast bucked and reared, nearly unseating the warrior holding the rope. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Jed understood, he must master it or be torn apart trying. The rope was thrust into his hands. Pain burned his palms as the horse yanked forward, nearly ripping him off his feet. He dug in his heels, heart hammering, every muscle screaming as the animal dragged him in circles. The crowd roared, some mocking, some urging. Jed clung tighter, sweat stinging his eyes. He remembered breaking colts as a boy, his father's harsh voice telling him to show the animal who commanded. But this was no farm colt, this was a storm with hooves. His strength began to fade. His knees buckled, and for a heartbeat he nearly let go. Then he thought of the boy, Little Hawk, alone among strangers who might decide his fate by Jed's performance. That image poured steel into his spine. He yanked the rope hard, twisting the beast's head, and somehow, through raw will and desperation, he pulled himself into the saddle. The horse went wild, thrashing, leaping, trying to hurl him into the fire itself. Jed clamped his legs tight, teeth bared, riding the chaos as though his soul depended on it. The crowd's cries rose into a storm of sound. Each second stretched into eternity until, at last, the horse's fury broke. It slowed, snorted, and stood trembling beneath him. Jed slid down, legs shaking, lungs burning. He stood in the firelight, chest heaving, the rope still clutched in his hand. Silence rippled outward. Then the warriors began to pound their spears against the earth in a rhythm like thunder, not jeers this time but something closer to respect. Iron Bear's gaze softened, though only slightly. He gave a single nod, an acknowledgement that Jed had endured. Jed wanted nothing more than to collapse, but he kept his back straight. He met the chief's eyes and said, low but steady, "You wanted to see what kind of man I am. Now you've seen." Before Iron Bear could answer, a new sound split the night. Not drums, not chants, gunfire. Sharp, violent cracks echoed from the ridge above. Shouts followed, then screams. Warriors scattered, grabbing weapons, children pulled into tents. Jed's stomach dropped. He knew the sound too well: rifles, repeating shots, settler steel. Figures appeared at the edge of the firelight, raiders, their faces shadowed by bandanas, their guns spitting flame. They had come not to talk but to burn. The camp erupted into chaos. Warriors charged forward, arrows loosed into the dark, while the raiders fired into the crowd indiscriminately. Jed's instincts screamed at him to dive for cover, to save his own hide. But then he saw Little Hawk stumbling near the fire, exposed, a raider leveling his rifle at the child's back. Without thinking, Jed grabbed the nearest dropped weapon, a rifle slick with another man's sweat, and swung it up. The shot cracked, slamming into the raider's chest before he could pull the trigger. Smoke coiled from the barrel as Jed turned to face the oncoming storm. Iron Bear glanced at him through the melee, their eyes locking. No words were spoken, yet something passed between them, a recognition forged not in speeches or trials but in the crucible of blood. Jed spat into the dirt, braced his stance, and chambered another round. "If I'm gonna die tonight," he growled, "it sure as hell won't be running." The battle roared around him, and Jed charged forward, rifle blazing, shoulder to shoulder with the very people he once called enemies. Smoke swallowed the night, acrid and suffocating, curling into Jed's throat with every breath. The camp blazed with chaos, warriors loosing arrows, raiders firing rifles, the shrieks of horses tearing through the dark. Jed moved through it like a man possessed, the borrowed rifle hammering against his shoulder, his boots sinking into churned earth slick with blood and mud. He had fought battles before, but never with such clarity. Tonight, the line between friend and foe was no longer written in color or creed, it was carved in courage. A raider lunged from the shadows, blade raised high. Jed swung his rifle like a club, the crack of bone echoing as the man fell. He stooped to snatch another weapon from the ground, a revolver, its chamber still half-loaded, and fired into the melee without pause. Around him, warriors surged with terrifying grace, their war cries piercing the thunder of gunfire. Through the smoke, Jed caught sight of Little Hawk, crouched beside a toppled tent, clutching his blanket tight. A raider broke from the fray, charging straight for him. Jed shouted, his voice raw, legs pumping faster than his battered body could manage. The world shrank to that single desperate race. He fired once, the bullet grazing the attacker's arm, then threw himself forward, slamming into the man with bone-rattling force. They rolled in the dirt, fists and steel flashing. Jed took a blade across the forearm, hot pain searing, but he wrenched the knife away and buried it deep. He staggered upright, breath ragged, vision swimming. Little Hawk stared at him, wide-eyed, not with fear but with something deeper, trust. That look anchored Jed, steadied him, reminded him why he hadn't simply fled into the dark. He forced a grin, blood smeared across his face. "Stay low, kid. I got you." The battle stretched into eternity. Flames consumed half the camp, tents collapsing in showers of sparks. Still the warriors held, their unity a shield against the raiders' steel. Jed fought at their side, each shot an oath, each strike a confession of who he had been and who he was becoming. He felt the years of guilt peeling away with every act of defiance, every moment he chose life over destruction. At last the tide shifted. The raiders, realizing their ambush had failed, began to break. Some scrambled to their horses, others fled on foot, shadows vanishing into the plains. Warriors pursued, their cries echoing like thunder rolling into the distance. The gunfire dwindled, replaced by the moans of the wounded and the crackle of flames. Jed dropped to one knee, chest heaving, the revolver slipping from his hand. His arm bled freely, but he pressed it closed with grim resolve. Around him, the camp was ruin, bodies strewn like broken dolls, smoke veiling the stars. Yet amid the devastation, there was life. Survivors gathered, voices rising in grief and relief alike. Children clung to mothers, warriors clasped hands, and above them all, the chief stood tall, his face illuminated by firelight. Iron Bear approached, his steps slow, deliberate. He stopped before Jed, studying him as though seeing him for the first time. For a long moment there was silence, broken only by the pop of burning wood. Then the chief extended his hand, scarred and strong. Jed stared at it, sweat dripping into his eyes, before grasping it firmly. Iron Bear's grip was like iron itself. He said something in his language, words Jed couldn't understand, but the tone carried respect. A single word followed in broken English, heavy with meaning, brother. Jed swallowed hard, throat tight. The word hit him deeper than any wound. He nodded once, unable to muster more, afraid his voice would betray the storm inside him. As dawn crept over the horizon, painting the plains in pale gold, the camp began to rebuild. Fires were doused, the dead honored. Jed stood apart for a time, watching. The boy approached, slipping his small hand into Jed's callous palm. The simple gesture stilled him. He looked down at Little Hawk, who gazed back with quiet certainty, and for the first time in years, Jed felt the stirrings of belonging. When the sun finally crowned the hills, the tribe gathered their horses, preparing to move on. Jed knew the offer would come, that he could stay, live among them, shed the last of his old life. Yet when Iron Bear met his gaze, Jed shook his head gently. "My place is there," he said, glancing toward the horizon where his ranch lay waiting. "But if you'll have me, I'll be a bridge. Not an enemy, not a ghost. A man worth remembering." The chief inclined his head in solemn agreement. The boy lingered a moment longer before climbing onto a pony. As the warriors rode out, their silhouettes cutting against the rising sun, Little Hawk turned back and lifted a hand in farewell. Jed watched until they vanished into the distance, the silence of the prairie settling once more. The barn and the field still waited for him, as lonely as before, yet he felt something had changed. He was no longer just a man running from ghosts. He had chosen, at last, to stand for something greater than himself. He exhaled slowly, the weight of night lifting with the morning light. "A man," he murmured to the empty air, "ain't measured by the blood he's spilled, but by the mercy he dares to show." His words faded into the wind, carried across the open land. Somewhere, he hoped, they would be heard. And as he turned back toward home, he carried with him not just scars, but the ember of redemption, glowing steady in the vastness of the frontier. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Every act of kindness carries farther than a bullet, and sometimes, farther than a man can ever ride.